Liz, over to you.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, everyone, for attending today for STC's Knowledge Exchange. I'm Liz Pohland. I'm STC CEO, and I'm the moderator for the panel today. Our session is on inclusive language, and we will focus on defining what inclusive language is, why it is important, and focus on some key principles technical communicators can use to be prepared to examine their assumptions about how other people think and feel when writing or designing content. I'm joined today by Erin Galloway, the Director of Operations, Membership, and Community Relations, and our distinguished panelists. I'm going to introduce them while Erin prepares a quick poll so that we can find out who's in the audience today and maybe tailor our responses to some questions to accommodate who's here. So to start off with, I'd like to introduce Viqui Dill. As a documentation specialist for the Navy Federal Credit Union, Viqui Dill is passionate about continued education and lifelong learning for those in technical communication. Sharing tips and tricks she has gathered in her 20+ years as a writer, she is actively promoting networking with other writers to help us all learn and stay connected. Viqui describes herself as a technical writer, wife, mom, bass player, and worship leader. She's happiest when folks sing along with her. Thank you for being here today, Viqui. Next, I'd like to introduce Larry Kunz, who is an STC fellow. He is an information architect with Extreme Networks, where he leads the company's inclusive language working group. He is also active in the Inclusive Naming Initiative, a cross-industry partnership working to promote and facilitate replacing harmful and exclusionary language in information technology. Larry is a seasoned technical writer, project manager, consultant, trainer, and content strategist. He has taught classes and made conference presentations on a wide variety of topics to technical communication. And last but not least is Dr. Laura Palmer, who serves at the department as the department chair for technical communication and interactive design at Kennesaw State University. Before becoming an academic, Laura worked as a graphic designer and print production specialist. After learning about STC and all that it offered, she eventually went on to pursue a PhD at Texas Tech University. Her interests in technical communication occur at the intersection of humanities mindsets and technology. She teaches classes in digital accessibility, SEO, and analytics. Currently, Laura's research is examining accessibility in gaming. How fun. So thank you all for being here today, and thanks you to our attendees for filling out the poll. Looks like we have quite a diverse group of people who some are members and have been for a short time, and some have been for a long time. And we even have some non-members here, which is great. And then we have some other data that may help the panelists in tailoring their questions. So thank you very much. Erin, you can stop sharing the poll. So panelists, I'll start off today by asking you to tell us a bit more about how you became interested in inclusive language and how you educated yourself about it. Was it something that you had to do because your workplace required it, or something you personally wanted to adopt? Or was there a time when you maybe had an experience with inclusive language that made you interested in it? And I think I'll start with Larry for this question.
Okay, thanks, Liz. My story with inclusive language goes back about 2 years to the summer of 2020. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, I think there was a much greater awareness of that there are different people who see the world differently, and we need to get outside of our own mindsets. And I attended a couple of conferences late that summer where there was just a lot of buzz about this and a lot of conversation, and a lot of people at that time were saying, well, you know, what is this? What does it mean to be inclusive? How does that affect our work as technical communicators? And I became very interested in that. I came home and started talking it up among our technical documentation group, and got very, very enthusiastic acceptance. And it spread to the engineering teams, the design software user interfaces. And we started a working group in the company. And about the same time, I learned about the Inclusive Naming Initiative, which is an industry-wide consortium in the technology industry that promotes inclusive terminology. I think I'll say more about that later, but that's where I got started. And I guess the last thing I'll say is just in the course of 2 years, we've gone full speed from what is this to really getting a good understanding of it, and what do we do about it, and how do we make it work in our own job. So it's really phenomenal acceptance and growth in this particular topic.
Thank you. Yes, I think, that was about the time I started hearing this term as well, about two to 3 years ago. So that is very, timely. Viqui, how about you?
So, hey guys, this inclusivity, I think, is a good term. I mean, in the old days, we used to call it equal opportunity, right? And then we sort of expanded the term so that it's more than just opportunity. It's sort of like belonging and that kind of stuff. And my journey along that road started in 1978. I was the first woman engineer hired at a chemical plant. And I blogged about this because it was quite the experience. And I think that looking back on it, like our current, it almost seems hilarious because of the way that I was treated. And out of a place of love, I was called girl all the time. And I'm an adult woman, right? And I want to be respected as an engineer. I'm not the candy striper, right? Not that there's anything wrong with candy stripers, but I'm not a volunteer. I am a paid professional. And when I talked to the people who were using the term girl, they thought it was a compliment. So it's both sexist and ageist. And so that was, my journey started in 78. My son is on the autism spectrum. And so language and belonging and inclusivity is very important to my family. And just trying to, expand that to my whole world. And I'm using Larry as a resource. Before the webinar started, we were talking about some resources. And when we get to the resource part, I can't wait to hear what he says. So.
No pressure, Larry.
Yeah.
Now, I love the personal experience you've had with it too. That's really, heartwarming to hear about. And Laura, how about you? How did you get involved with inclusive language?
So mine started a long time ago. I used to write to Canadian press when I worked in Canada, and language was starting to change there. So we started using fisher instead of fisherman as an example. And as I moved along through academia, well past now my working days in industry, I am what's called safe space trained. And safe space is designed, you put a placard on your wall when you're done, and it means I'm a safe place for persons who don't identify as binary in gender, so LGBTQIA. I thought that designation, and we learn about how non-binary people like to use pronouns and other types of language. So that was a bigger introduction, and that was about 10 years ago. And recently I've been working in the accessibility field, and what do we call persons with disabilities? And just things like you have to make a big distinction between deaf, because the deaf community is an actual entity, versus hearing impaired, low vision, vision impaired. So you start to learn about different types of language that persons with disability issues apply to their specific situations.
Yes, absolutely. It's very widespread, this field, I'm finding. So let's start then with some definitions for people who may not have heard of inclusive language or don't know much about it, and also talk about why it's important. Most attendees today certainly probably know that language is important and how powerful it can be, but it can also be a problem if you're not using it correctly. It can create barriers and impact others. So why should technical communicators specifically know about inclusive language, and why is it important to them? And I'll go around at this time and start with Viqui.
So I'm a word nerd, and I realize that, words are powerful things. And as we write or as we present, the words that we use have a potential to motivate people in a good way or in a positive way. I know that when I'm reading something, I read, older things were like written in the 40s, and they're always talking about the men that, the men that were involved and they were hardy or whatever. I do feel like it might not apply to me. And I want to make sure that the things that I write are more inclusive for that. And then just in my own dealings with my coworkers and people in the community, I have people all along different gender identity spectrum, and every now and then I will say yes ma'am or yes sir when I needed to have chosen the other one, and I feel terrible. So I want to learn and I want to do better. I want to make fewer mistakes, but at the time when I do make mistakes, I want to be forgiving and I want to be forgiven. So words are powerful things.
Absolutely. Laura, how would you define inclusive language, or how important it is?
Well, I define inclusive language as bringing everyone into the conversation. And for technical communicators, that goes right back to the fundamental principles of know your audience. We need to think very carefully about our audience, and our audience may not be anyone like us. So for example, in my work with Safe Space, I meet a lot of people who express their identity in very different terms and pronouns, and I have to incorporate that into my classroom work. With accessibility, again, because the whole idea of accessibility at the fringe of society, we need to make sure we are, again, bringing persons with disabilities into the greater conversation and making sure we identify correctly and precisely what they may be experiencing. So as an example, I often say neurodivergent individuals now. It's just, the things that we need to start doing. So I think it's just a great step into modernizing our thoughts and moving away from the idea that our community, any community, is just one homogeneous lump.
Right. And I would suspect that while it also brings everyone together, it also reduces risk for like the university or the business as well, for you not to be using inappropriate terms, right?
Correct. Yeah. And I spent some work on the Policy Process Council here, and I ended up being what I call the veterinarian of the language. I had to tell the guy, you need to neuter that and get the G's out.
Right. Larry, how about you? How do you define inclusive language and its importance?
Well, our mission statement at Extreme Networks is that we are ensuring that all content makes people feel included and comfortable. And Viqui used a word that I have heard more and more lately, and I really like. It's belonging. We want everyone to feel like they belong in the conversation or in the interaction with our products and services, because when we say content, we mean not only the communication that comes from us, the technical docs, the marketing content, as well as the software user interfaces. Are there field names, for example, that people will find offensive or feel excluded as a result of? So we need to be sensitive to that. And there's a good business reason for it. You mentioned a moment ago that reducing of risk. So much of marketing has changed from, here I have a product, I'm going to give you a sales pitch and I hope you'll buy it, to really establishing relationships with customers and potential customers. And this goes for consumers, if you're selling to consumers, or business to business, it's the same. We want those people to feel like they belong. We want them to feel comfortable working with us. And that's what we tell folks at our company as one of the big benefits of inclusive language. But really the biggest benefit is it's simply the right thing to do. It shows respect for other people. And that is paramount.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think those are a great display of different ways of describing this. Related to that, what are some examples of inclusive language? I know a couple of you have already mentioned them, but you might have others you wanted to share. And how does inclusive language differ from other terms like plain language or DEI, which has already come up, or accessibility, or does it not differ? Is it just part of a larger umbrella? For this, I'll start with Laura.
Okay. I tend to agree generally the implementation is part of a larger umbrella of just bringing everybody to the table. And there are just so many domains, though, of inclusive language, whether it's in learning cognition, whether it's in physical abilities, or just a gender kind of neutral place. But the thing is, we've not thought about it very much as writers and how we're going to bring that in. So I think it's just an important thing that we can look at in a big picture, but also start to tease out the areas where it is important for our work.
Thank you. Viqui, how about you?
So, I've heard before that our technical writing is like the glass in a window pane, right? When we've done a good job, you don't notice what we've done. The message comes through. And when we haven't done a good job, it's like having a dirty window, right? And so when we use these words that are sort of speed bumps and that slow people down, then we're not doing our job, because then all of a sudden the language comes in to play. And I wanted to tell a story about my instructional design and learning group. We have been doing these informal First Fridays with the idea that we want to get students involved. We want to introduce people in a fun way to technical communication. So we have these First Fridays at 5 events. And one of the things we wanted to do was this thing that I learned how to do at STC, which is when I make a PowerPoint presentation and it's somewhat humorous, and then I give it to someone who's never seen it before and they have to present. And we thought this would be good for our students because they would learn how to think on their feet. It would give them good interviewing kind of skills and good practice. And the name of those things was what we used in STC, was a ninja talk. And apparently ninja is a word that doesn't belong to me. I am not in the culture that would have that kind of people. And so I've been struggling for a word to use for someone who's in like leadership and has a good grasp, because the words that I want to use aren't available to me. Ninja is a word that I want to use. Guru is a word that I want to use. Sherpa is a word that I want to use. And sometimes master. We have Scrum masters. And how are we going to, hopefully we can find a better way to describe that job. So this whole, I have a great deal of skill in this area, but we need a fun kind of way to talk about it. But so what we did for IDL was we decided to call it improvisational PowerPoint, which is kind of boring, but it's inclusive. It says what it is. And then as people are reading through it and as we're discussing it, it's not a speed bump that says, hey, you're not really, in that community. That's not your word. And I learned last night, I was sharing with my church, because I did want to share a couple of things about my church and inclusive language. And I have a friend who's a freshman in college, and he said that the word ninja is apparently on TikTok being used as code for the N-word. And it was like, wow, that is the very last thing. Oh, and yeah. So, and we have good intentions, right? We want to make a message and we want it to be memorable, but we don't want it to be a stumbling block for someone. So that's my story about technical communication. Just, we want to make sure that when we write, that the words themselves don't distract people, that the message comes through. And that's what we try to do.
Yeah, and I think I'm also a word nerd. And I think, since I've been really reading up on this, I think more about what a word, the connotations it may have, its history and where it came from, what culture it originated from, and whether it's an appropriate use. I just had a conversation with my mom yesterday about the word stewardess, which she was using. And I was like, no, we call them flight attendants now. There's a certain, and educating other people, I think, is part of this too, in a positive way. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, is you're not a bad person if you use the wrong word. You just may not know that it has all these other connotations, and it's okay to learn more about it and then change from that. Yeah. So I appreciate your examples, Viqui. It's great.
Can I tell one more?
Oh, sure, Jack, please.
So yeah, because you were talking about words and their history. right? So in my church, we have a lot of strong women. And so sometimes in other churches, we will be referred to as those uppity women at the church. Well, so we thought, well, this is fun. That's a fun word, right? And let's get t-shirts. Well, it turns out the history of that word is very racist. And so as a church, we didn't want to be wearing this, racist thing. And so, thank you, Google, and thank you, thesaurus.com. So we're calling ourselves a rebelliously self-assertive women. But, you don't know until you start to do the research, and things like I hear a lot of times, something that will be included as a legacy will be referred to as grandfather, and that seems totally fine. But the history of the word is not good, and so we learn by doing, and we have to be able to accept the feedback and, accept it in the spirit in which it's given. I don't want to make it impossible for you to wear this t-shirt. I just want you to use a different word.
Yep, fair. And Larry, how about you?
Yeah, and for the people listening who might be new to this topic, that is a big, big part of what we're talking about, is just become more aware and think about asking the right questions. You might not have known the history of the term uppity. You might not have known the history of the term grandfather. I didn't until I started looking into inclusive language, and I was very surprised at its racist history. So you don't have to know all the etymologies and the stuff from the thesaurus. You just need to have the sensitivity and say, is this going to be a stumbling block? I better ask the right question. Liz, you mentioned plain language. This is like plain language in that it is about removing those stumbling blocks, but it's a different kind of stumbling block. Plain language obviously removes barriers to understanding that are based on improper terminology or poor sentence structure and that sort of thing. This is different. This removes terms and concepts that are offensive in some context, or might reflect that cultural appropriation like Viqui was talking about with words like ninja. And we need to be sensitive to that and make sure that we don't include those speed bumps or roadblocks or whatever you like to call them in the content we create.
That's a great definition of each of those, and that helps a lot in explaining it. Related, you've all been involved with inclusive language in your own companies and organizations or your church. What advice can you provide to those who want to adopt principles of inclusive language at their workplaces or in their personal lives? And how can we be advocates for inclusive language, especially in workplaces that may not, be doing this yet? I mean, do you recommend things like style guides or terminology guides or something related to that? Or how did you get started? Larry, I'll start with you.
Well, the easiest advice is start wherever you are. You may not be in a position with a lot of influence in your company, but you have colleagues, you have friends you talk with, and you certainly can take up the subject with them. Maybe say, hey, if you're interested in this, let's look into it together. If you have any influence over the style guide, I think that's a great tool. We certainly updated our style guide and keep it up to date to reflect the terms and their alternatives that would be preferable. But start where you are. That's what I did, as I mentioned at the top of the show, and I was amazed how far it took me. Now I'm in a monthly meeting with all the diversity and inclusion group leaders in the company, and the executives are in that meeting, and we each have a turn to talk about what's going on in our little areas, and it's really caught fire and become quite a significant part of the corporate culture. So start where you are and see where it takes you.
That's great advice. Laura, how would you approach that?
I go with listen, learn, and look. So listen to how people talk in your organization and what term they use. As an example, grandfathered is used a lot around higher ed. So you listen, you learn, see what people are doing, look at the documents that the institution creates and look at some of that language. And oftentimes it really just needs modernizing its old policy and process that hasn't kept up. And finally, really look at your audience and try to determine more about them. And you can certainly ask questions too. I find that the non-binary audiences that I interact with are very happy to explain to me how they like to be addressed or what they're thinking, etc. So I see that as a really valuable starting point. And just as an aside, I am encouraging a friend of mine to present to STC on alternative style guides. There's a whole bunch of work coming out in that field academically and non-academically as well. And I think that would make a great presentation at the conference in 2023.
Thank you, Laura. And Laura, you're doing a webinar for us soon too on something related, correct?
Yeah, I'm going to be doing attaching the ideas of universal design and accessibility together. And universal design is about making something work for everyone. And that can mean, of course, design, but we're going to also include language in that as well.
Great. Well, we look forward to that. Viqui, how about you?
So I was thinking about, my current workplace and in the context that my son is, I have an autistic son. And some of the language that we use at my current workplace would trip him up. And some of just the floweriness in our language would trip him up. Every now and then I'll hear somebody say caught between Scylla and Charybdis, and I don't know if, when was the last time you read the Odyssey, but I bet it was high school, and so that we also might say rock in a hard place, but my son is very concrete, and he would probably advocate, us saying between two difficult choices, instead of Scylla and Charybdis, which in a way that is sort of elitist, right? For us to all assume that you've had the classics, and that you've read the classics. And so sometimes just sort of simplifying everything. I went to a session at my new company on diversity and belonging, and it was a really good session, but I had kind of a hard time finding the room because, it's locked down and we don't go to the office. And so I was told to, at the security desk, that I was to look for the auditorium. Well, so I'm going, I turn right and I'm looking and I see doors that are called training room, and there's 3 of them. Well, apparently if you open up the training room, all 3 of them, they form the auditorium, but it doesn't say that on the door, right? And I could see people like my son, or those of us that are really concrete. I'm looking for auditorium, it starts with an A, right? And I'm not looking for the training room. And these kinds of things is a sort of, I've always been around here, and so I know that that's the auditorium, but I'm brand new, and so we want to make sure even just the small things we do, not just the big writing, but just the little name tag type writing, everything. I think it is never a waste of time to think about it and think about, how can I make this better, easier? Because, what's the saying? A rising tide floats all boats, right? And curb cuts, I think they were put in for veterans, but they also help moms with strollers. They help me when I've got a rolling backpack, all these kinds of things. I think it's just good for us to keep that in mind, because it helps everyone.
Yeah. So my question to you then is, if you found those things at your workplace that were not appropriate or not up to par, in your opinion, how would you go about changing that? Do you bring it up? Do you talk to your supervisor? How do you make the work culture more inclusive? So
I am lucky, as we were talking about, it's Monday, and so my company doesn't have meetings, where meetings are outlawed until 1 o'clock. My company does some really wonderful things, and one of the things that we do is once a quarter, our technical writing staff, we get together on and have learning what we learn from one another. And I talked to my supervisor, and we have a inclusive language. And I think we'll just start with the basics. I'll start with, I got a resource from Larry and it sounds like I need to do some Googling on the inclusive naming initiative, sort of a neutral third party. And with the idea that everybody has my best interest, your best interest, our customers' best interest, and best interest of the company. We are here to make things better. I mean, that's what technical writers do, right? Otherwise, we could write for marketing, right? If we wanted to just write for money, technical writing, in our hearts, we want to help people. So I'm lucky enough to have that kind of a thing. Now, if you don't have that kind of a thing, there are some suggestions in one of the documents that I got from Larry. If you're in a meeting and somebody uses a word that could be a stumbling block for another, do you call them out in the middle of the meeting? Probably not. Do you make sure that you're using the correct term in the meeting? Definitely. And if it becomes an issue, I'm looking at the faces here of the panel. We are all white people. And I think it's appropriate for us to show sometimes when someone within a community is talking to me about what hurts them, it is a powerful thing. But if I can tell you about my son, and this is the kind of thing that hurts him, and you and I are peers, I think that's also powerful. So I think, even though we all have faces that don't necessarily show our diversity, I think we can be good allies. I think that we can show each other how to be good allies. And so I'm lucky enough to have a company that makes room for that. So
good. That's good to hear. So a couple of you have mentioned it multiple times throughout this, is the resources. What resources can you all recommend to the people attending and those who may listen to the recording later, where they can learn more about inclusive language? And I know you've hinted at a few, but I'll start with Larry. Do you have a few resources you'd like to share? And if we can put it in the chat too.
Yeah, I'll certainly start with the Inclusive Naming Initiative, which is inclusivenaming.org. And what this is a consortium that sort of started from the grassroots under the auspices of the Linux Foundation. It is centered around technology, but that's a very broad area. It's not just open source software, as you might think with Linux, but it's all kinds of information technology, hardware, software, communications, networking. The intent is to raise awareness of the need for inclusive language, to help people be aware of what damaging terms are out there, and especially understand what the better alternatives are. So if you go to that site, you'll see a little bit about the organization, but do look at the word lists. That is the primary deliverable of the INI at this point. We have recommendations, and we have tiers of recommendation. Like, these are really bad, you really need to replace them right away. Master slave is an example of that. And then there's a middle tier and there's a lower tier. Hey, if you can fix this, and here are the reasons why, and here are the alternative terms. And there's even a few terms that we considered and decided, these are not going to be stumbling blocks, but we're going to list them here anyway, kind of in case you were wondering. Because again, I think having that awareness and asking the questions is important. And so INI is a good resource. One other I'll mention, and I should have done a little homework, but most of you have probably heard of the product Acrolinks. It goes through your content as you're writing and spots problems with mechanics, terminology, and so forth. And they've done a good bit of work in inclusive language as well. And I know at one time they had published some presentations about that. So I think if you go to Acrolinks' website, there it is. How about that? Thank you, Liz. Posted right there in the chat.
I just saw it the other day, and I was really impressed by what they've done.
So I haven't looked at it lately, but it looks like they're really keeping it up to date, and big thumbs up to them. So I'll let someone else speak now.
Thank you, Larry. Laura, I've got Laura and Larry mixed.
I know.
Laura.
All the bills. I was just going to follow up on what Vicky was saying from a minute ago. Here in higher ed, building names are a nightmare. My building is 1358 or the J building or atrium. And it depends what document you're looking at and who you are as to what you label that building by. And so people will hit me up at the beginning of the semester in the parking lots with, where's 1358? And I said, oh, that's over there. That's the J building. We have terrible naming conventions here. Going back to what Larry was saying, one of the resources I think is great is certainly look at the GLBTQ plus sites at any major university. I don't know, I looked at University of Wisconsin's the other day because they were pretty good. What you want to do is get an idea of alternative pronouns as an example, and they are very complicated. When to use Z and Zer and herself and the nuances of language in there. And certainly any group within a university will help you work with language to get it better and more exact. So look around university websites because that will help you really understand the spectrum of diversity that exists for people on sexuality lines.
Yeah, I agree with that, Laura. I was looking up inclusive language to get ready for this panel, and I found a lot of university websites that had thousands of resources, not even just their own, but others listed. So I think that's great advice. And that's some of the leading cutting edge work being done in this field is in academia. So it makes a lot of sense. So thank you. Vicky, any resources you want to share?
So like I said, I picked up some resources from Larry, and then I found some more by Googling. And I've written down a couple of notes about other resources. And I just wanted to, one more story, because Laura started talking about pronouns. I mentioned before that I'm trying to incorporate more inclusive language in my church. I'm the worship leader, so I'm the one who makes the slides that say what the words to the songs are going to be. And in the old days, we used to refer to God as a he, him, right? And we've been trying very hard, and my denomination has been able to sort of work that sexual or gender bias out of the songs. But people like me who've been singing the same song for like 50 years with the words he, him in them, it's very, very difficult for me to get me to change. So even when I have the resources and I have the updated hymnal, I still fall back into the old patterns. And I hope everyone will forgive me because I am trying. But sometimes you just have to say he walks with me and he talks with me. So
yeah, and we fall back on what's easier sometimes, not what's best. Somebody asked about actually sexism in the chat. I don't know if you all saw it, but she's new to STC and feels great being here. But her question was about how this subject can be addressed in relation to sexism. And I know, Vicky, at the start of the hour, you did mention being in an environment in the 70s where, you were called a girl and that was not appropriate. But do any of you want to address that question for the person attending?
Yeah, I saw that question and I wanted to reassure her that that is a big part of inclusive language. One of my favorite examples, and I grew up in the 60s, I'm kind of a space geek, and I was following the NASA Artemis launch, which unfortunately didn't happen this morning. It was scrubbed. But if you look at the press coverage of that, you'll see that the mission is uncrewed. And we would have said unmanned for decades and decades and decades, but it is uncrewed is a better choice. There is no crew. So that's just one of many examples. I know in the Inclusive Naming Initiative, we've dealt with terms like man in the middle, which is a security breach and not a good description for that. There are better terms. And in human relations, we don't talk about manpower. I'm sorry. Yeah, HR. We don't talk about manpower anymore, for example. So many examples, and it's extremely relevant here. And I'm glad someone raised that question.
And I also think one of the other questions I want to talk to you all about is how you address this in the interview setting, because a lot of times things about sexism and other inappropriate phrases may come up in an interview, or when you're preparing for an interview or preparing your portfolio. Are there things people should look out for or be prepared to answer in a job interview? Laura, I'll start with you. You have some thoughts?
Okay. Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. Certainly read the CV or resume very carefully to see if they have specified a specific pronoun sequence that that person likes to have used with their name. Also, just look at their use of language. For example, when I worked with my boss, they really enjoyed, so you might see them, neutering the language as they create a narrative about their past experiences. So be very aware of little markers that might tell you you're going to be interviewing someone who's going to be more interested in inclusive language, and think about that. Now, here in higher ed, I think we're very sensitive to inclusive language, but we still have some huge stumbling blocks here as well. So I think no organization is perfect, but do your best. I think what people see is if you are doing your best to move in the right direction, it's a great start.
Okay, thank you. Viqui, do you have thoughts about the interview portfolio preparation or from the interviewer's perspective?
So, I just wanted to talk a little bit about you can see in my Zoom that I have my pronouns in my Zoom name. I think one of the ways that I can feel like it's okay for me to ask you what your pronouns are is for me to tell you what mine are up front. And I do have that in my email signature. I have it in my work email signature. I have it in my Zoom profile. I have it in my SharePoint profile at work. And that sort of gives, if I'm willing to be vulnerable, then you can be vulnerable back to me. And I think it's up to us to, especially for me, it costs me nothing to say I'm a she, her, nothing. Obviously I'm a girly girl, right? But for others, there's a big risk. And I want to make sure that when they are brave enough that the words don't get in the way, that they feel like it's not this weird thing to disclose your pronouns because the rest of us have already done it.
Right. And I think that's such a good explanation for why we should do that. I had not ever heard that articulated before, but it's become kind of a thing. We even had at the STC conference ribbons this year where you could put your pronouns on so that you could make conversation with other people at the event easier. So I think, I appreciate you explaining that. That's a great example. How about you, Larry? Anything about interviewing or portfolio preparation you'd like to share?
I certainly just would advise everyone to look through your portfolio and see if there are any terms that could be stumbling blocks, that you've been using and maybe hadn't thought about before. And if necessary, scrub that out of your portfolio because it is something that folks are aware of and will notice. And you certainly want to make your best impression during the interview and the application process.
Yeah, I would certainly think, especially HR people would be very keen on this, and you might not even get to an interview if your documents have something offensive in them. So that's very helpful. So let me just ask if any of you have any closing thoughts. We are going to end right on time at 2 today, but did anybody not get to say something they wanted to say or something they wanted to bring up? Larry, do you want to start?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on a few things that other people have said. Forgiveness, it's important and it is abundant. I think Viqui said this, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't become paralyzed because of this. But if you make a mistake, genuinely ask for forgiveness. And as I say, fall forward. Yes, you make a mistake, but you are moving forward and you're going to become a better person. So don't be afraid, but be willing to fall forward and ask for forgiveness and be an ally. You may not belong to a specific group that is subject to discrimination in terms of some of the terminology we use, but you probably have family members, you certainly have friends and colleagues who this is very important to, and be their ally. And finally, again, as I said, you're not sure what to do. You're thinking, well, I don't have any influence or power in my position, to start where you are. Do some editing on some content today that you're working on, and see if the terminology is all good. Check the resources that we talked about, and raise your awareness. Start wherever you are. And lastly, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn if you want to continue the conversation. Liz posted our LinkedIn links back at the beginning of the session.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah, all great advice and great terms. I will admit, I will be the first to admit I used a really horrible word in a meeting not that long ago. And one of the attendees who's here today called me on it. And I apologize profusely. I knew it wasn't a good word when I said it, but it just came out. And yeah, that's a key thing to be able to do, is to say, oh, I have made a mistake and I apologize for it. And I'm going to move forward and be better because you helped me realize that. So I think that's great advice. Viqui, how about you? Last thoughts?
So last thoughts, we haven't talked at all about privilege. We've talked a lot about sort of looking outside. I think it would also be a good use of our time to look inside and to appreciate. Don't feel guilty about the privilege that we have, but appreciate it and use it for good.
Thank you. Thank you. And Laura, final thoughts from you?
My final thought would be step beyond your community. There's a whole online world out there of different groups, and they're interacting, and it is so easy for us now to pop on into a group and look and observe and see what's happening. Stretch your mind. Make sure you're keeping up with changes. Language is forever morphing.
Thank you. Great. And my final question that I always ask at the very, very end is, what you have all been long STC members. So what is your favorite STC benefit for those who maybe not even a member who are here today? And are there any benefits that we offer that you think are related to inclusive language or learning more on this? Viqui, how about you?
Well, my favorite benefit is the rough drafts. You know, that's the band that we have. So we have some talented musicians in STC, and every now and then we all get to play some rock and roll together, and that is definitely fun. But I use STC stuff all the time, and at my work I am asked, hey, what does STC say about stuff? And I kind of want people to sort of jump in the pool with me, but that's not happening. But STC is definitely seen as an industry leader and as the voice of the technical writer. So I just appreciate that so much.
Thank you. And Laura, any benefit? What's your favorite benefit?
My favorite benefit is actually intercom. Now, you might think teaching, I would love the journal, and I do love the journal, but for undergrads, intercom is much more easy to comprehend and take in and has a lot more relevance. So it works really well in the classroom. And we're teaching instructional design this semester, so I made sure the intercom on instructional design made the rounds.
Great. And as a past editor of Intercom, you know, I love it too. And I think Larry even had an inclusive language article in Intercom not that long ago. Right, Larry?
It's probably been about 1.5 years now, but yes, definitely.
So that's great. And your favorite benefit, Larry?
It's got to be the networking, the belonging to communities, both chapters and SIGs, and being able to volunteer. Every job I've had, except for the very first one, I have gotten in large degree because of people I knew in STC, and they knew me, and I'd worked with them. And then all of the skills I apply in my work day to day, so many of those came from involvement in STC chapter leadership and committees. It's just been a wonderful resource. And so don't just sign the paper and join, but become part of a chapter or a SIG and volunteer.
Right. I think that's the way to get the most out of STC is to really engage with it, not just, you know, pay your dues and expect things to come to you, but to really be participating. And Aaron, I'm going to pass things back to you because I know you have a final slide that includes some LinkedIn for our LinkedIn addresses for our panelists and some other information about future knowledge exchange. But we do want to end right on time. So I'll pass the baton, but I also wanted to mention Slack. We do have a Slack channel open to the public. It has quite a few different topic areas, and one of them is for knowledge exchange. So if we didn't get to a question you may have, or you want to ask the panelists something, feel free to go to our Slack channel and check that out and engage further in public about these conversations, because these are important questions to be talking about. So thanks to the panelists for your time today. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone who attended today and asked great questions. And Erin, I'm passing it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, and again, just as Liz just mentioned, this last slide that you should be seeing on your screen now just has some contact information, so you can easily reach out to STC staff, either stc@stc.org or membership@stc.org. If you have any questions about anything regarding STC or how you can get involved, we're happy to help, either Liz or myself. I shared the LinkedIn profiles earlier with all of our panelists. You're free to reach out to them directly in that way, and here are their links, as well as in the chat. You'll find them in the chat. And here's the direct link to connect to all of our social media platforms. If you have them, we recommend that you do that. Even if you aren't a member of STC, please link to us, talk to our members. They're fantastic people. And I've been dropping some links into the chat as we've been going through with STC benefits. So please feel free to take advantage of those, as well as some of the resources that were mentioned by our panelists. And if you have any questions, we will look forward to answering them. And again, the last link that I just sent was to the Knowledge Exchange site. We invite you to join us on other panel discussions that we have each final Monday of the month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time US, and also to our new member meetups that take place the second week of each month, just to be able to meet new members and talk to others just like yourself. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you at future programs. Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. And if you want to share this recording, it'll be on our YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that.
Yes, please feel free to watch these or any of our other Knowledge Exchange recordings on our YouTube link, and it'll be on the Knowledge Exchange page as well.